The wind, a relentless sculptor of the plains, had etched lines of worry onto Ilara's face long before the stagecoach groaned to a halt in the dusty heart of Redemption. It was a name that tasted like ash in her mouth, a bitter irony given her current predicament. Dust, the color of forgotten sorrows, coated everything, the raw lumber buildings that leaned like weary old men, the boardwalks that sighed underfoot, and Ilara herself, a small, still figure swathed in a grey shawl that did little to distinguish her from the muted landscape. Her hands, clasped tight in her lap, were damp despite the oppressive heat, the paper within them, a flimsy contract of hope, crinkled beyond legibility. Each lurch of the coach had been a jolt to her already frayed nerves, the miles devouring what little courage she had managed to hoard. Now, stillness was a new kind of torment. The air, thick with the scent of horse manure, cheap whiskey, and something indefinably desolate, pressed in on her, heavy as a shroud. She could hear the gruff calls of the driver, the creak of leather, the thud of luggage hitting the parched earth, but it all seemed distant, filtered through a haze of apprehension. Her intended, Mr. Alastair Abernathy, was supposed to be here. A man she knew only through 3 sparsely worded letters, each one promising a respectable life, a sturdy home, an escape from the quiet desperation that had been her only companion since her mother passed. The letters had spoken of prosperity, of a new beginning. They had not spoken of the hollowness in his written words, a hollowness she had willfully ignored. A man, florid-faced and smelling faintly of bay rum and impatience, detached himself from the small crowd gathered near the stage office. He consulted a slip of paper, then his eyes, small and assessing, scanned the disembarking passengers. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a too small cage. He was older than she'd imagined, stouter, his waistcoat strained across a prosperous belly. His gaze passed over her once, twice, then settled, a frown etching itself between his brows. He approached, his boots loud on the wooden planks. "Miss Ilara Ainsworth?" he inquired, his voice carrying an unfortunate nasal tone. Ilara could only nod, her throat constricted. Words, always elusive companions, had deserted her entirely. She felt the weight of a dozen curious eyes, sharp and uncharitable. He looked her up and down, a slow, deliberate appraisal that made her skin crawl. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable. "Well," he finally pronounced, his lips thinning into a line of distinct displeasure. "You're smaller than I envisioned. And rather quiet, aren't you?" His gaze flicked to the watching townsfolk, a hint of theatricality in his gesture. The advertisement, if I recall, spoke of a woman of good health and pleasant disposition. It said nothing of mousy. The word, uttered with a disdain that stung more than any physical blow, hung in the air. A snicker rippled through the onlookers. Ilara felt a hot flush creep up her neck, a tide of humiliation that threatened to drown her. She wanted the earth to swallow her whole, to disappear into the dust that seemed to mock her very existence. I can be pleasant, sir," she managed, her voice a mere whisper, lost in the vast, uncaring expanse. Abernathy snorted, a sound of utter dismissal. "Pleasant? Child, you look as if a strong gust of wind would carry you off. And I've yet to hear you string together a coherent sentence. My establishment requires a woman of fortitude, someone with a bit of spirit. Not this." He waved a dismissive hand in her direction. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake. A misunderstanding. This arrangement will not suit." The finality in his tone was like a door slamming shut in her face, leaving her stranded on the wrong side, in the cold. Her small trunk, containing all her worldly possessions, sat forlornly in the dust beside the stage, a testament to a journey made in vain. The hope that had been a flickering candle within her was snuffed out, leaving only a cold, acrid smoke of despair. She was alone, penniless, in a town called Redemption that offered her none. The vast, indifferent sky arched above, the sun beating down without mercy. The whispers of the crowd were a low, cruel murmur, the soundtrack to her ruin. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness. What was she to do? Where was she to go? The immediate aftermath of Mr. Abernathy's pronouncement was a blur of muted sounds and sharp, unwelcome stares. Ilara stood rooted to the spot, the dust settling around her ankles like the ashes of her hopes. The stagecoach, divested of its passengers and cargo, rumbled away, leaving behind an echoing silence that amplified her isolation. The small crowd, having witnessed the brief, brutal drama, began to disperse, their curiosity sated, their hushed comments trailing behind them like an unpleasant odor. No one met her eye. She was a pariah, an object of pity or, worse, scorn. Her trunk, a pathetic symbol of her failed aspirations, remained beside her. Eventually, the stationmaster, a stoop-shouldered man with eyes that had seen too much of human folly, cleared his throat. "Can't leave that there, miss," he said, not unkindly, but with the weariness of one who wished to be rid of a problem. Ilara flinched, the sound of his voice startling her. She looked at her trunk, then at the unyielding facades of the buildings lining the street. Each doorway seemed closed to her, each window a blind eye. Her meager savings had been exhausted by the journey, the return fare was an impossibility. Her mind, a frantic prisoner, beat against the bars of her circumstance. Where could she go? What could she do? She had no skills that this raw, masculine town would value, beyond the domestic arts Abernathy had so summarily dismissed. Her shyness, always a burden, now felt like a leaden cloak, suffocating her. She found herself drifting, aimless, towards the less salubrious end of the main street, where the buildings grew shabbier and the laughter harsher. A gust of wind swirled dust and refuse around her, stinging her eyes. She spotted a narrow alleyway between the saloon and a dilapidated general store, a sliver of shadow offering a brief respite from the relentless sun and the curious gazes. It smelled of stale beer and something else, vaguely rotten. But it was, for the moment, a place to be unseen. From this shadowed alcove, she watched the town unfold. It was a place of harsh edges and sudden noises, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the raucous shouts from the saloon, the clatter of wagons. Men, mostly, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their movements economical and purposeful, or sometimes swaggering and loud. The few women she saw hurried by, their expressions guarded, their skirts held clear of the filth. There was a rawness here, a sense of life lived close to the bone, where survival was a daily struggle, and softness was a luxury few could afford. And then she saw him. He was apart from the others, not by physical distance initially, but by an aura of quiet self-containment. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed at odds with the town's frenetic energy. He was tall, lean, his clothes functional and worn, the color of the earth itself. His face, when she caught a glimpse of it beneath the brim of a battered hat, was angular and stern, tanned to leather by the elements. He rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, it was brief, his voice low. He might be a trapper, she thought, or a homesteader from one of the outlying claims, come to town for supplies. The townsfolk seemed to afford him a wide berth, not out of fear, perhaps, but out of a kind of mutual, unspoken agreement of non-interference. He seemed to carry his solitude like a familiar coat. He came to the general store, emerging after a time with a sack of flour slung over one shoulder and other, smaller parcels. As he passed the mouth of her alley, his gaze, surprisingly sharp and observant, swept over the shadowed space. For a fleeting moment, his eyes met hers. There was no judgment in them, no pity, merely a flicker of acknowledgement, as if he saw not just a woman in distress, but simply a woman. Then he was gone, his stride unhurried as he headed towards a tethered horse, as solitary and stoic as its owner. Ilara watched him go, a strange little flutter in her chest. He was an enigma, a silent watcher like herself, though his silence seemed to stem from strength, hers from fear. In her desolate state, even that brief, neutral glance felt like a minuscule crack of light in an otherwise impenetrable darkness. She remained in the alley, the chill of the evening beginning to seep into her bones, wondering how long she could last before hunger or the elements, or simply the crushing weight of her despair, consumed her. As dusk bled into a star-pricked night, the alleyway became colder, the shadows deeper and more menacing. Ilara drew her shawl tighter, the thin wool offering little comfort against the encroaching chill or the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. The sounds from the saloon grew louder, coarser, punctuated by bursts of laughter that felt like stones thrown at her fragile composure. Sleep was an impossibility, every creak and rustle from the darkened town sent a jolt of fear through her. She had managed to retrieve her trunk, dragging it further into the alley's dubious shelter, but it offered no solace, only a reminder of her utter failure. She was contemplating the bleakness of another day, another night, when a subtle sound near the alley's entrance made her heart leap. A footstep, too quiet for the boisterous patrons of the saloon, too deliberate for a stray animal. She pressed herself against the rough wooden wall, holding her breath, envisioning ruffians, or worse, Mr. Abernathy returning to heap further scorn upon her. A figure paused at the alley's mouth, silhouetted against the faint light spilling from the street. It was him, the quiet man from earlier, the one with the observant eyes. He stood there for a long moment, and Elara thought perhaps he hadn't seen her, that he would move on. But then, he took a few steps into the alley. He didn't approach her directly. Instead, he stopped a few feet away, and without a word, he placed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle on the ground. It was a gesture devoid of fanfare, almost furtive, as if he too wished to avoid attention. He straightened, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in her general direction, and then turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the night's other sounds. Elara waited until she was certain he was gone, her breath still shallow, her pulse a frantic drum. Cautiously, she crept forward. The bundle lay on the dusty ground, unassuming. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped the coarse cloth. Inside were 2 thick slices of bread, a piece of hard cheese, and a slightly bruised apple. Simple fare, yet to Elara, it was a feast, a miracle. Tears pricked her eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of a bewildered gratitude. Why? Why would a stranger do this? No one in Redemption had offered her so much as a kind word, let alone sustenance. She ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, the rough bread scratching her throat, the cheese sharp and tangy, the apple's sweetness a forgotten luxury. It was more than just food, it was a lifeline, a flicker of human kindness in a world that had seemed utterly devoid of it. The man's name, she learned later from snippets of conversation overheard near the general store, was Silas. Silas Blackwood. He lived alone, further out, on a claim some said was cursed, others said was just too hard to work. He kept to himself, traded furs and sometimes crops for his necessities, and was generally regarded as an oddity, best left undisturbed. The next evening, the offering was repeated. A small parcel left in the same spot, containing a piece of dried meat and a twist of paper holding a handful of parched corn. Again, no words, just the silent act of provision. Elara began to anticipate his quiet arrivals, a pinprick of warmth in the cold dread of her days. She would watch for his tall figure, his distinctive, unhurried gait. He never sought acknowledgement, never lingered. His help was as unobtrusive as his presence in town. A tentative thread of trust began to form in Elara's heart, fragile yet persistent. He asked nothing of her, made no demands. His actions were stark, simple, and in their way, profoundly respectful of her desperate privacy. He did not try to speak to her, did not offer pitying glances. He simply saw a need and, in his own quiet way, met it. She started to leave a small, smooth stone on the spot where he left the food, a silent token of her thanks, the only currency she possessed. The next day, the stone would be gone. This wordless exchange became their ritual, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of loneliness and societal rejection. His quiet consistency was a balm to her raw nerves, a silent testament that perhaps not all humanity was as cruel as Mr. Abernathy, or as indifferent as the gossiping townsfolk. The precarious balance of Elara's existence, sustained by Silas Blackwood's silent charity and the dubious shelter of the alley, was shattered by the arrival of the autumn rains. What began as a light drizzle soon swelled into a relentless downpour, turning the dusty street into a morass of mud and the alley into a sodden, miserable trench. The wind howled through the gaps in the buildings, carrying the rain in stinging sheets. Elara huddled deeper into her corner, her shawl soaked through, the damp chill seeping into her bones, mocking her meager attempts at warmth. Her small store of kindling, hoarded for a tiny, smokeless fire, was quickly ruined. The nights became an agony of shivering, the days a grey expanse of misery. Silas's nightly provisions continued, sometimes a little damp despite his care, but the small comfort of food was overshadowed by the unrelenting cold and wet. One evening, the storm raged with particular fury. The alley was a stream, her trunk sitting in inches of muddy water. Ilara felt a despair so profound it bordered on surrender. It was then, through the driving rain, that Silas appeared, not just with food, but with a heavy oilskin coat slung over his arm. He surveyed her wretched state, his expression unreadable in the dim light, though she thought she saw a flicker of something, concern, perhaps, in his deep-set eyes. He didn't offer the coat immediately. Instead, he looked around the flooded alley, then back at her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and rough, like stones rubbing together, yet it was the first direct address she had heard from him. "This ain't no place for anyone," he stated, a simple fact, not an accusation. Ilara could only nod, teeth chattering too hard for speech. He hesitated, then said, "My place ain't much. But it's dry. And warm." The offer hung in the air, startling in its directness. Her mind raced. Go with this stranger, this solitary, near-silent man, to his remote homestead? The idea was terrifying. Yet, what was the alternative? To perish slowly in this alley? She looked at his face, trying to read his intent. There was no guile there, only a kind of stark weariness, and perhaps, a genuine, if gruffly offered, concern. The memory of Abernathy's smooth, deceitful words contrasted sharply with Silas's blunt offer. He seemed to sense her hesitation. "No expectations, miss," he added, his gaze steady. "Just shelter from the storm. You can help with chores, if you've a mind. Earn your keep, so to speak." The suggestion of utility, of being able to contribute, however humbly, was a small, crucial anchor. It lessened the sting of charity, offered a sliver of dignity. She thought of the way he had provided for her without drawing attention, without demanding thanks. He had shown her a quiet decency. Taking a ragged breath that hitched in her chest, she managed a single, tremulous word. "Yes." The journey to Silas's homestead, made the following morning after the worst of the storm had passed, was arduous. He had a sturdy, if old, wagon, and he loaded her trunk onto it with an economy of effort. The track leading away from Redemption was little more than a muddy scar on the landscape, winding through sparse, windswept prairie and into low, wooded hills. They traveled mostly in silence, the creak of the wagon wheels and the snort of the single, patient horse the only sounds for long stretches. Ilara, perched beside him on the hard wooden seat, observed the land. It was wild, untamed, possessing a stark, lonely beauty that both intimidated and captivated her. Silas handled the reins with a practiced ease, his attention on the path ahead, his profile resolute against the bruised sky. Occasionally, he would point out a landmark, a distant butte, a particular configuration of trees, with a single, gruff word. "Water there. Good timber." Ilara, in turn, found herself contributing in small ways. When a wheel became mired in a particularly deep patch of mud, she instinctively gathered fallen branches to provide traction, working alongside him without needing instruction, her movement surprisingly efficient despite her sodden clothes and weariness. He glanced at her once, a quick, appraising look, before returning to his task. It was a shared hardship, a small, unspoken acknowledgement of mutual effort that felt more significant than any polite conversation. The first glimmers of a partnership, born not of words, but of necessity and action, began to surface in the quiet, shared struggle against the indifferent elements. Silas Blackwood's homestead was nestled in a small, sheltered valley, a good distance from any neighbors, further still from the prying eyes of Redemption. It consisted of a small, sturdily built log cabin, a lean-to barn, and a patch of cleared land where the remnants of a summer garden struggled against the encroaching autumn. Smoke curled thinly from a stone chimney, a welcoming, if solitary, beacon in the vast wilderness. The place was Spartan, functional, stripped of all but the essentials, much like the man himself. There was an order to it, a sense of everything having its place and purpose. Inside, the cabin was a single room, dominated by a large stone hearth where a low fire now crackled, radiating a blessed warmth that Ilara felt seep into her very bones. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools, a narrow cot in one corner, and shelves laden with provisions and tools completed the furnishings. It was basic, undeniably so, but it was dry, and after the misery of the alley, it felt like a palace. Silas indicated the cot. Yours, he said simply, then turned to tend the fire, adding more wood. He offered no further explanation, no awkward attempts at pleasantries. He moved about the small space with a quiet efficiency, preparing a simple meal of stew from dried meat and hoarded vegetables. Elara, unsure of her place, found herself watching him, her initial apprehension slowly giving way to a cautious curiosity. He didn't seem to expect conversation, and for this, she was profoundly grateful. Her shyness, though still present, felt less like a crippling defect here. In the vast silence of the wilderness, broken only by the crackle of the fire or the sigh of the wind outside, her own quietness seemed to blend in, to belong. They fell into a rhythm dictated by the land and the season. Mornings began before dawn, Silas heading out to check his trap lines or to fell timber, Elara tending the fire, attempting to bring order to the small cabin, mending his worn clothes with neat, almost invisible stitches, a skill her mother had painstakingly taught her. She learned to bake a dense, serviceable bread in a cast-iron pot nestled in the embers, to make soap from ash and rendered fat, to identify a few edible roots and late berries in the woods surrounding the cabin. These were tasks of survival, and in their execution, she found a quiet satisfaction. Her hands, once soft and unaccustomed to labor, grew calloused, her body leaner, stronger. The label "too shy, mousy" began to lose its sting. Here, in this isolated pocket of the world, with a man who demanded nothing of her but competence, her intrinsic worth, buried deep beneath layers of fear and societal disapproval, began to surface. There were no onlookers to judge her quietness, no societal expectations to fall short of. Silas, when he was present, rarely spoke more than a few necessary words. "Need water. Wood's low. Storm coming." Yet his silence was not unkind. It was a comfortable quiet, born of self-sufficiency and a life lived in close communion with the natural world. He observed her, she knew, in his own unobtrusive way. He noted her quickness to learn, her diligence, the way she conserved their meager resources without complaint. Once, when she managed to repair a particularly torn section of his hunting jacket with a patch so neat it was barely discernible, he picked it up, examined the stitching for a long moment, and then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of approval. No words, but it was praise enough. She found herself observing him too, the way he moved through the forest with an almost preternatural awareness, the patience with which he fashioned a new handle for an axe, the surprising gentleness he showed the old horse. A respect, unvoiced but deeply felt, grew between them, nurtured in the shared silence and the daily rituals of survival. Her fear of him had long since evaporated, replaced by a tentative trust, and something else, something she couldn't quite name, that felt like a quiet understanding. One blustery evening, as the wind howled a mournful song around the eaves of the cabin, Elara was tidying the small shelf where Silas kept a few personal, non-essential items, a whetstone, a small, carved wooden bird of surprising delicacy, a much-folded and refolded letter whose script was faded almost to invisibility. As she carefully dusted around them, her fingers brushed against a small, velvet-lined box she hadn't noticed before, tucked away at the very back. Curiosity, a rare indulgence, overcame her. She opened it. Inside, nestled on the faded velvet, was a miniature portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, and beside it, a tiny lock of baby-fine, blonde hair tied with a blue ribbon. Elara's breath caught. It was a glimpse into a past Silas never spoke of, a sorrow carefully guarded. She closed the box quickly, a pang of guilt mixing with a wave of unexpected empathy. It explained, perhaps, some of his reserve, the deep lines of grief etched around his mouth that she had previously attributed solely to the harshness of his life. She said nothing, of course, but the knowledge settled within her, adding another layer to her understanding of this quiet, solitary man. He, too, carried burdens. A few days later, while mending a tear in her own worn dress, one of the few she possessed, a small, pressed flower fell from a hidden pocket. It was a faded violet, a memento from her mother's small garden, a reminder of a gentler time, before loss and desperation had driven her to answer Mr. Abernathy's advertisement. Silas, entering the cabin with an armful of firewood, noticed her staring at the fragile bloom, her expression wistful. He paused, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "From home?" he asked, his voice unusually gentle. Ilara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. It was the hard leaving, she managed, the words barely a whisper. He simply nodded, a grave understanding in his eyes, before turning to stack the wood. It was a small exchange, yet it felt significant, a shared acknowledgement of past sorrows, of the invisible wounds they both carried. Her own strength continued to surprise her. One afternoon, while Silas was away checking distant traps, a pack of coyotes, emboldened by hunger as winter approached, grew alarmingly close to the small chicken coop he had painstakingly built. The half-dozen hens were their only source of fresh eggs. Fear, cold and familiar, threatened to paralyze her. But then, thinking of Silas's hard work, of their precarious store of food, a different emotion surged, a fierce, protective instinct. She grabbed the heavy stick Silas kept by the door, her heart pounding, and ran towards the coop, shouting, her voice raw and unfamiliar even to her own ears. She flailed the stick, making herself as large and menacing as possible. The coyotes, startled by this unexpected, vocal apparition, hesitated, then scattered back into the woods. Trembling, Ilara leaned against the coop, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had acted, not hidden. She had found her voice, however desperate. When Silas returned and she recounted the incident, her words clipped and understated, he listened intently. He checked the coop, his expression thoughtful. "Good," he said, "finally. You did good." The quiet praise warmed her more than the fire. She was no longer the mousy, timid creature rejected in redemption. Here, in the crucible of the wilderness, she was discovering a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Her shyness hadn't vanished, but it was transforming, becoming a quiet fortitude, a thoughtful reserve rather than a debilitating fear. She was learning to stand her ground, in her own way. The fragile peace of their isolated existence was shattered one crisp morning by the unexpected sound of approaching riders. Ilara, who had been outside scattering feed for the chickens, froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Silas, mending a harness near the barn, straightened slowly, his eyes narrowed towards the track leading to their valley. 3 men on horseback emerged from the trees, their demeanor arrogant, their clothing a touch too fine for the wilderness, suggesting they were not ordinary trappers or homesteaders. One man, heavyset with a florid face and a cruel twist to his lips, rode slightly ahead. Ilara's blood ran cold. It was Abernathy. Behind him were 2 others, rough-looking men who surveyed the small homestead with predatory interest. Abernathy's gaze swept over the cabin, the barn, and then landed on Ilara. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying the same nasal condescension she remembered with a visceral loathing. "If it isn't Miss Ainsworth. Found yourself a rustic protector, have you?" His eyes flicked dismissively toward Silas, who stood silent and watchful, his stance relaxed yet utterly alert. "I heard tell you'd run off with some recluse," Abernathy continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Didn't imagine it would be quite so primitive." One of his companions snickered. Silas remained still, his expression unreadable, but Ilara could feel the tension coiling in him, a dangerous stillness. "What do you want, Abernathy?" Silas's voice was low, flat, but with an underlying edge of steel. Abernathy's smile widened. "Just paying a social call. And perhaps, rectifying a mistake." He looked at Ilara again, his eyes lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "Town talk says you've become quite the capable little thing out here. Perhaps I was too hasty in my judgment. A man in my position needs a wife who knows her way around a homestead, even if she is a bit on the quiet side." Ilara felt a surge of nausea. The audacity, the sheer arrogance of the man, was breathtaking. He spoke as if she were a piece of property to be reclaimed at his whim. Before Silas could speak, something snapped within Ilara. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overlaid with a white-hot anger, a sense of outrage that burned away her usual reticence. "I am not a mistake to be rectified, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly steady, carrying across the small clearing. "And I am not yours to claim." Abernathy looked taken aback for a moment, his smirk faltering. He clearly hadn't expected her to speak, let alone with such firmness. Silas shot her a quick, almost imperceptible glance, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Surprise? Approval? Feisty now, are we? Abernathy recovered, his tone hardening. This arrangement, he gestured vaguely between her and Silas, is hardly proper. A young woman alone out here with a man like him. He spat the last words out with contempt. It's not seemly. I'm offering you a chance at respectability. I have found more respectability here, Mr. Abernathy, than you ever offered, Ilara retorted, her chin high. The two men with Abernathy shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between Silas and their employer. Silas hadn't moved, but his presence seemed to grow larger, more formidable. You've heard the lady, Silas said, his voice still quiet, but now imbued with a chilling finality. She's made her choice. This is my land. You're trespassing. I suggest you leave. Abernathy's face flushed an ugly purple. You think you can keep her, Blackwood? A reclusive half-savage like you? She'll come to her senses. Or perhaps, his eyes narrowed, I'll have to persuade her? He made a subtle motion, and one of his men reached for the rifle scabbarded on his saddle. The air crackled with imminent violence. Their quiet life, their tentative peace, was about to be torn apart. The threat hung heavy in the crisp autumn air, as tangible as the scent of pine and damp earth. Abernathy's man had his hand on his rifle, his eyes hard. Silas didn't move towards his own weapon, which leaned against the barn wall, a deliberate display of non-aggression that was, in itself, a warning. His stillness was that of a coiled spring. There'll be no persuading, Silas stated, his voice unwavering, each word dropping like a stone into the silence. She stays. You go. Abernathy scoffed, his bluster returning. You and what army, Blackwood? He clearly underestimated the quiet man before him, seeing only a lone homesteader, not the deep well of resilience and capability that Ilara had come to recognize. It was Ilara who acted first, in a way that surprised everyone, including herself. Her mind, sharpened by months of self-reliance, worked quickly. She had seen the way Abernathy's horse shied at sudden movements, the way he held the reins with an insecure grip. Taking a deep breath, she snatched up the empty grain bucket she had been holding and, with a sudden, sharp cry that was more animalistic than human, hurled it with all her strength towards the flank of Abernathy's mount. The metal bucket clanged loudly against the horse's side. The animal, already skittish, reared violently, whinnying in panic. Abernathy, caught off guard, yelped and clung on for dear life, his face a mask of terror as he fought for control. The sudden commotion startled the other two horses as well. The man reaching for his rifle was thrown off balance, his attention momentarily diverted. In that instant, Silas moved. He wasn't fast in a flashy way, but with a lethal economy of motion. He closed the distance to the rifleman in 3 long strides, his hand shooting out to grasp the rifle barrel, wrenching it upwards just as the man, recovering, squeezed the trigger. The shot exploded harmlessly into the air, the sound deafening in the small valley. Silas used the man's momentum against him, twisting the rifle and sending him sprawling to the ground. The third man, seeing his companion disarmed and Abernathy still wrestling with his panicked horse, seemed to lose his nerve. He hesitated, his eyes wide, clearly not paid enough for this kind of direct, dangerous confrontation. Ilara, adrenaline coursing through her veins, didn't stop. She grabbed a sturdy fallen branch, her earlier weapon against the coyotes, and stood her ground near the cabin door, her eyes blazing, a silent guardian of their home. She was no longer the shrinking Violet Abernathy had dismissed. She was a woman defending what was hers, what she had helped to build, however modest. Abernathy finally managed to regain some semblance of control over his horse, his face puce with rage and humiliation. He saw his man disarmed, Silas now in possession of the rifle, and Ilara standing defiant with her makeshift club. The fight had gone out of them. "You'll regret this, Blackwood." Abernathy snarled, his voice tight with fury. "Both of you. This isn't over." But his threats lacked conviction. He pulled hard on his horse's reins, turning it awkwardly, and spurred it back towards the track, his undignified retreat hastened by another panicked skitter from his mount. The remaining 2 men scrambled to follow, one retrieving his lost hat, the other casting a wary glance back at Silas, who watched them go, his expression grim, the captured rifle held loosely in his hand. They disappeared into the trees, the sound of their retreating hoofbeats fading, leaving behind a ringing silence, broken only by Elara's ragged breathing and the nervous stamping of Silas's old horse. The immediate threat was over. They had faced it, together. Silas slowly lowered the rifle. He turned to Elara, his gaze intense. He looked at the branch clutched in her hand, at the fierce, protective light still shining in her eyes. A muscle worked in his jaw. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen from him. "Seems you found your voice, Elara," he said, his tone laced with a rough, undeniable respect. The echoes of the confrontation lingered in the valley long after Abernathy and his men had fled. The sharp scent of gunpowder, faint but distinct, hung in the air, a stark reminder of the violence that had threatened to erupt. Elara's legs felt weak, the adrenaline ebbing away to leave a profound weariness in its wake. The branch she had wielded dropped from her nerveless fingers. Silas walked over and picked up the grain bucket, its side dented from its impact with Abernathy's horse. He turned it over in his hands, his expression thoughtful. The cabin, the small garden, the surrounding woods, all seemed imbued with a new significance, a preciousness that came from having nearly lost them. He walked back towards her, stopping a few feet away. The silence between them was different now, not the silence of strangers or mere acquaintances, but the quiet understanding of comrades who had faced a common enemy and prevailed. "You were brave," he said, his voice low. It wasn't effusive praise, but coming from Silas, it was profound. Elara looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly. "I was frightened," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "But I couldn't let him. I couldn't." She couldn't articulate the complex web of emotions, the violation of their sanctuary, the insult to her dignity, the threat to Silas, to the fragile life they had carved out. Silas nodded, his eyes holding hers. "Fear's a part of it. It's what you do with it that matters." He gestured towards the cabin. "Come. Let's have some coffee." The morning's been eventful. Inside, the familiar scent of wood smoke and drying herbs was a comfort. Silas methodically started preparing coffee, his movements sure and steady, restoring a sense of normalcy to the disrupted morning. Elara sank onto one of the stools, watching him. The terror of the confrontation was receding, replaced by a deep, quiet sense of rightness. She had stood up for herself, for him, for their home. She had not been the mousy creature Abernathy remembered. She had found a strength she hadn't known she possessed, a voice that, though quiet, could speak with conviction when necessary. He poured 2 cups of a strong, bitter brew and handed one to her. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that sent a small, unexpected warmth through her. They drank in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant call of a jay. "He might come back," Elara said finally, voicing the thought that lay heavy between them. Silas looked into the fire, his expression grim. "He might. Or he might decide we're more trouble than we're worth. Abernathy's a bully, not a fighter. He likes easy targets." He paused, then added, "But we'll be ready." "We." The word resonated in the small cabin, a simple pronoun that encompassed so much. It wasn't just his land, his fight, anymore. It was theirs. Elara felt a profound sense of belonging, a feeling she hadn't experienced since her mother was alive. It wasn't born of romantic declarations or societal approval, but forged in shared hardship, mutual respect, and the quiet defense of their shared existence. She looked at Silas, at his weathered face, the lines of past sorrows and present resilience etched there. He was not a handsome man in the conventional sense, nor was he given to charming words. But he was steadfast, honorable, and he had seen her true worth when no one else had, not even herself. He had offered her shelter, not as a possession or a subordinate, but as an individual. He had given her the space to find her own strength. The fear of Abernathy's return was real, but it was now tempered by a quiet determination. They had faced him once, they could face him again. She was no longer alone, and in that knowledge, there was an immense, quiet power. The rejection that had once defined her seemed a distant memory, a painful catalyst that had, improbably, led her to this place, this man, this unexpected life. The seasons turned, winter blanketing the valley in a deep, silent white, then reluctantly giving way to the hesitant green of spring. Abernathy did not return. Perhaps, as Silas had surmised, he had decided they were too much trouble, or perhaps his bluster had simply found other, easier targets in redemption. The incident, though, had left its mark, not as a scar of fear, but as a crucible that had tempered their bond, solidifying the unspoken partnership between Ilara and Silas. Life settled back into its rhythm of hard work and quiet companionship, but with an underlying current of deeper understanding. Ilara found that the voice she had discovered in defense of their home did not entirely disappear. While she remained a woman of few words, her shyness had transformed into a gentle reserve, a thoughtful quietude. When she spoke, it was with purpose, her opinions considered, her suggestions practical. Silas, in turn, listened. He had always respected her actions, now, he valued her counsel. True worth, Ilara came to understand, was not measured by societal graces or the volume of one's voice, but by the resilience of the spirit, the capacity for quiet connection, and the courage to stand for what mattered. Her rejection in redemption, once a source of profound shame and despair, now seemed like a strangely fortuitous misdirection, a harsh path that had led her away from a life of polite subservience to one of genuine partnership and self-discovery. She was no longer Ilara Ainsworth, the rejected mail-order bride. She was Ilara, a woman of the wilderness, strong, capable, and quietly confident in her place beside Silas Blackwood. Her transformation was evident not in grand pronouncements or dramatic changes, but in the small, steady ways she inhabited her life. There was a new assurance in her movements as she tended the garden, which, under her care, flourished with a surprising abundance. There was a calm authority in her eyes when she looked out over the valley that had become her sanctuary. She learned to read the signs of the weather in the clouds and the behavior of the animals, to move through the woods with a quiet grace that mirrored Silas's own. One evening, as they sat by the fire, a comfortable silence enveloping them, Silas reached into his pocket and drew out the small, carved wooden bird Ilara had seen on his shelf. He turned it over in his calloused fingers, then offered it to her. "My father made this," he said, his voice softer than usual. "For my mother. She loved birds." It was a rare sharing, a glimpse into the guarded recesses of his heart. Ilara took the small carving, its wood worn smooth with time and handling. She traced the delicate lines of its wings, understanding the depth of the offering. "It's beautiful," she whispered, meeting his gaze. In his eyes, she saw not just the shadow of old grief, but a flicker of something new, something hopeful. Their future was not defined by conventional terms, no vows spoken before a preacher, no societal sanction sought. Yet, their commitment to each other was as solid and enduring as the ancient stones of the valley. They were two solitary souls who had found an anchor in one another, their lives intertwined like the resilient vines that climbed the cabin walls. The land remained wild, the challenges of survival ever present, but they faced them together, a silent, steadfast team. As the sun dipped below the western ridge, painting the sky in hues of rose and violet, Ilara looked out at the peaceful valley, a profound sense of contentment settling within her. Here, far from the judgment of towns and the expectations of others, she had found her true worth, and in Silas, a partner who saw it, cherished it, and stood beside her, strong and unwavering as the mountains themselves.